So I thought I'd do a small block Chevrolet versus small block Ford video here, since they seem to be in constant competition with each other and varying opinions. So I'm going to take an unbiased approach here to each block in the heads and just the entire motor as a whole. So the first thing I'm going to reference here on the Chevrolet is the timing cover, the camshaft and timing chain. Now, with the Chevrolet, you don't have any plate like on the Ford that locks this cam in place. So this cam is actually able to move back and forth, like you can see, because there's nothing holding it. And it could actually even, if you're real unlucky, come out and slap the timing cover, or you can see here, well, you can kind of see, but not really, but it's moving the lobes on where the lifters would ride. So, you know, that's a little odd. So that's the first thing. And these bolts here can wiggle loose, but it's not a big deal with these Chevrolets. You can just buy a locking plate and then they won't go anywhere. But so that's kind of an interesting topic. Also, while we're on the front of the engine here, you see the timing cover. Now on Fords, they come down and go over the pan. And with Fords, if you don't put the harmonic balancer on to help line it up, center it up, you'll always have a front seal leak. Now Chevrolets, sometimes they have front seal leaks, sometimes they don't, but all in all, the timing cover comes on and off a lot easier. I don't know if it's necessarily, I would say, better on the crank here, on the front main seal, but it's definitely an easier item to install and remove, as is the water pump, which is obviously just simply these four right here, versus on the Ford where it goes, I think I got a timing cover over here, versus the Ford where it's like all around the timing cover. So the Chevrolet water pump is a lot easier to deal with, as is the timing cover. But the timing chain probably sees a lot of premature wear, and the reason that the camshaft can move around. So anywho, okay, so with the pan off this Chevrolet motor, we can get a close look at the lower rotating assembly. And the first notable difference about the Chevrolet is it has the thrust bearing in the back, where the Ford has the thrust bearing in the middle. So that is a difference. I'm not sure the significance, but they are different in that regard. On the Chevrolet, the oil pump is press fit in, which for my own opinion here, usually it just concerns me a little bit, where the Ford has two bolts that hold this sump onto the oil pump. So it'd be pretty catastrophic if this were to wiggle loose when the engine was running. So that's a difference there. The Chevrolet uses this oil filter adapter. You can kind of see the outline of it here, for to hook your oil filter up to, where Ford, theirs is, we can take a look here at this block. It's just right on the block, just cast and machined in. So that's a difference there. And this requires an extra gasket, but overall, generally the same deal. One common theme with Chevrolets, except for the rod bolts, is they like to use smaller bolts, but more of them. So, like on the heads, it's that way. There's a lot more head bolts on a Chevrolet than there are on a Ford, but the Ford bolts are bigger. So, either way, it's two different takes on it. What I did have to do on my motor stand, for fear of breaking this little ear off the block, or any of these when the heads were on, when I first took the motor on, was I had to make this bottom bracket here to grab onto the three remaining bell housing bolts to add some strength. One other thing is that's smaller is the crank bolt on a Chevrolet is smaller, and what I do, I like to turn my motors over when I work on them, but with these you really can't when they're fully assembled. But what I do is, instead of turning this crank bolt, which you could possibly snap on a higher compression engine, is I make a little adapter that hooks onto the harmonic balancer with a big bolt head in the middle, and I'll turn that instead. So that is a difference. The Ford has a lot bigger bolt here, and you can turn that over without worry. So we're going to dive deeper in here and see what we can find. Looking at a Ford camshaft here, which is right here, in the Chevrolet camshaft, there are a few differences. The oil pump, or the fuel pump drive is actually a lobe on the Chevrolet camshaft, where Ford will has a bolt onto the front of the timing chain for the fuel pump, for the mechanical fuel pump on that. So that's a subtle difference. The main difference between these two camshaft designs, other than what we've already noted about the front block assembly, is the distributor location. Now the Chevrolet is obviously located on the back of the block, and the Ford is located on the front. Now, depending on your cowl configuration and your carburetor configuration, your rear distributor could be quite difficult at times to adjust your timing to get the little bolt undone. So generally you can just make yourself a little bent wrench and then it's easy, but it definitely takes a little bit more special of a tool to get to the Chevrolet. And on some Fords, depending on how much bull crap is slapped onto the top of it, it can be a hassle too. But generally, from my own experiences, the Ford distributor is a lot easier to deal with than the Chevrolet distributor. So we can see here a Ford connecting rod and a Chevrolet connecting rod, and the first thing we see is the Chevrolet rod is a lot longer, and Chevrolets with the crank and the rod together have a longer stroke than a Ford. We can see that the Chevrolet rod has less of a raised lip here on the sides, and the Ford's is pretty raised. The Ford rod overall, other than the rod bolts, where Chevrolet is bigger than the Ford, the Ford rod is a lot thicker than the Chevrolet rod. So either or, Chevrolet rods, it doesn't really matter. There's so many that you can, so many aftermarket steel cranks you can get, it doesn't even matter. But usually Fords, they'll run to higher RPM with the stock style bottom end than the 350 Chevrolet can, but with the a little extra money, not a whole lot with these 350s, and they can really wrap up as well. So it's not really a factor, but in the stock setting, we can see the differences here. So a little tech tip here on this Chevrolet. You always want to number your rods when you take them off for whatever you're going to do. It's just always a good idea to keep in mind where they go. So on a Chevrolet, it's pretty easy. If you start from the front of the motor, obviously this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 and 8 down in there. So, you know, that's pretty easy. One other thing I want to make mention of is rods are specific on which side faces the crank. Now, a lot of these 350 rods have these little ears on them. Now, those will always face the outer end of the crank. It will not face the other rod, so that's something to be aware of. And you always want to make sure that when you go to rebuild a motor, you bore it out and have it done correctly, and you check it before you reinstall it. As you can see with this motor, it wound up in pieces because when this was bored, it was instead of being 30 over, it was about 35 over, and I'm not sure if someone honed it or if it was bored out like that, but obviously that makes for a real oil burning motor, and with all that slapping around, it just destroyed these pistons. So, you know, when you're redoing stuff, you want to make sure that you do it right every time, because you'll pay for it in the end. There's one more thing I forgot to mention about the Chevrolet rods, other than having bigger rod bolts where the Chevrolet has 3/8 and the Ford has a smaller 5/16. The Chevrolet is also gets more of a linear action out of the rod and piston movement, where it hooks into the wrist pin, where the power is going straight up and down the piston more than how the Ford is designed, where the Ford actually gets more of an angle. So overall, that's a better quality about the Chevrolet than the Ford. The rods on the Ford are built a little tougher, but the Chevrolet rods get a better action out of them. Also on the top end here, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about engine heads for the fact that there's a huge aftermarket world, so heads are heads, but the one thing about Chevrolets that is always the same is they have the two exhaust ports that are right next to each other. On a previous Chevrolet build, I actually saw where the head was cracked right in that area between the two exhaust ports, and it was obviously a junk head, and you could see how it would get really hot in that specific area. So, and on Fords they're spaced out, so Fords don't have the heating problem. But so other than that, the heads, you know, they can go either way. There's a huge aftermarket world, and it really doesn't matter. The intake bolts on the Chevrolet, they're a little different than the Ford. They have more of an angle, and if you have the proper tools, it's not as big of a headache. But the Ford is a little bit easier to do, but with the proper tools, the Chevrolet is just about the same. The valve covers on the Chevrolet, either if it's the Vortec, which are better, but the old school style where it just has four, they have a tendency to leak a lot, I've noticed. Even if they're torqued correctly, they'll eventually develop some issues with leaking. So, and the other thing on the intake manifold itself is the thermostat housing. Now Chevrolet, even though they don't have like how the Ford over here has a tube where it can pass through before the thermostat opens, the Chevrolet has a design advantage on how the thermostat sits in, where it's real easy to put the housing on. Where on the Ford, when you put your housing on, you have to be real careful, as your thermostat can slip in between your intake and your housing, and then it won't seal, or you could crack your intake or your housing. So you got to be real careful on the Fords. And the Chevrolets, the thermostat usually just stays right in its relief in the intake, so not too much of a problem with the Chevrolet there. Chevrolets have an advantage where they have a thicker wall, so they can usually be bored to 80 over, where Fords, they can only go to 60 over, which you really don't want to go that high at all. I think I'd be pretty worried at 80 over with a Chevrolet and 60 over with a Ford, but the Chevrolet can still be bored more than a Ford can, so Chevrolet does have that advantage. Overall, obviously the prices on the Chevrolet parts are much cheaper than the Ford parts. A full-on rebuild kit for a Chevrolet motor is about half as much as it is for the Ford, and steel rotating assemblies and stroker kits and all that good stuff are generally a lot cheaper for the Chevrolet, and there's a lot more variety in the aftermarket world for the Chevrolet than the Ford. But other than that, the Ford block and the Chevrolet block are pretty darn similar, so it's pick whichever you want to go for and run with it.